Today's daf in Masechet Avodah Zarah is Ayin Zayin, 77. And yesterday, as you alluded to, we went through this very wild case where a person was a Safek Mitzorah. So he didn't know if he was a Mitzorah Muchlat. Remember, there's a lot of uncertainty in being a Mitzorah. The Kohen has to check you. They have to see if it's two hairs or one hair. And there's a lot of nuance involved in that. And it was uncertain, however the Safek occurred. And so the person, if he's a Mitzorah, is Tameh until he brings a Karban and becomes Tahar. If he's not a Mitzorah, he has no requirement to bring a Karban. And so what does he do? So the Mishnah, the Braita said, according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that you can do Kudshim even if it might lead to minimizing the time that you can eat it, it's not a big deal. You just bring a Karban. You say if I'm a Mitzorah, this is a Sham of a Mitzorah. If I'm not a Mitzorah, this is a Shlamim, and you bring it on the Mizbeach. Of course, if it's a shlamim, you're treating it like an asham, and you're only eating it for one day and one night, and you're limiting your participation, but that's okay, right? That's what Rabbi Shimon said. So then we talked all yesterday about the oil, right? Which is where it got really complicated, but that's not the point for today. Today, the question the Gemara asks, we are 7 lines from the top. Yativ Rav Rechumi. Rav Rechumi sat kamei de Ravina, ve'yativ ve'ka'amar mishmei de Rav Huna bar Tachlifa. So Rav Rechumi sat in front of Ravina, and he said this over in the name of Rav Huna bar Tachlifa, and he said, Nema, why don't you say Asham Zayehe Asham Taloi? Instead of bringing one animal and saying either it's a shlamim or an asham, say either it's an asham of a mitzorah or an asham taloi, right? Now remember, an asham taloi is brought when a person does a sin, and he doesn't know if he did a sin or did not do a sin. So instead of bringing a karban chatat, which you would bring if you for sure did a sin, you bring an asham taloi because you don't know. Now, of course, this guy didn't do a sin. He was a mitzorah. That's not a sin, right? So the reason you could bring an asham taloi is that if you recall, we discussed this earlier, there's an opinion that everybody sins, right? Someone did something wrong sometime. So you can say, I'm bringing an asham taloi basically like an idava, not really an idava, but saying, I'm sure I did something wrong at some point. This asham should fix that thing. And so you can bring an asham taloi and say, I don't really know what this is for, but I'm sure I owe an asham taloi for something. And therefore, I have an animal. It's either an asham mitzora or an asham taloi. And that solves all the problems because now it's an asham regardless, right? And so since it's an asham regardless, it's going to be eaten for one day and one night. It's going to be zichrei kuna. So you didn't basically limit the carbon in any way. So that was the question that they asked, the beautiful question, right? What do you see from here? He said, it must be that there's in fact a machloket about whether a person can be mitznadev and asham taloi, right? And it seems like Rabbi Shimon must be the person who says you cannot give an asham taloi anytime you want. Because if you could, the solution would be much simpler than bringing a shlamim and asham mitzora. It should be an animal and say either it's an asham taloi or an asham mitzora. So Shmami, now what you see from here is man tana de palag led Rebbe Eliezer. Who's a tana who argues with Rebbe Eliezer? Remember, Rebbe Eliezer's opinion is, as Rashi quotes it here, that a person can be mitznadev and asham taloi anytime he wants because he must have done something wrong. Rashi's further down. Mitznadev adam asham taloi b'chol yom she'ein lecha adam she'eno omed b'safek chet. Every person, unfortunately, has some doubt that they might have done a sin. So you see that Rabbi Shimon argues with Rebbe Eliezer. It must be Rabbi Shimon who Damer ein mitznadvin asham taloi. You can't make a nidava. You can't make a nidava, meaning a uncertain asham taloi. So this is what Rav Chumi said in front of Ravina, right? Amar Leina, Ravina looked at him and said, that's the most idiotic question I ever heard. He didn't use it. He didn't say it that way. He said, Torah, Torah. Oh my gosh. Think of Rashi says this means, why, oh, why? Here, where is the wisdom? Hechan hu Torah of a great person like you. You made the fundamental mistake that people make in Kachim all the time, which I do as well, which is you didn't keep your animal straight, right? Remember that an asham taloi, like every other asham, is an ayil. An ayil is a ram that's 2 years old, not 2 years old, but in the second year, right, shnei shanim. But the asham of the Mitzorah was a very special asham that was brought from a keves bat shnato, right? It had to be a first year keves, it had to be a baby. And so you can't mix these up because the animal brought for an Asham Mitzora is different than the animal brought for an Asham Taloi. And that is a fundamental mistake, as he says to him, where are we? Torah, Torah, Imri b'dichri michalfilach. You mixed up your Imrim and your Dichrim, right? You mixed up your young lambs, your young goats, I get, not goats, your young rams with your older rams. They are different animals. And therefore, since they're different animals, one is a first year animal. That's the asham of the Mitzora, and one is a 2-year-old animal, which is every other asham pretty much, but especially the asham of talui, and therefore you can't bring one animal and say either this is asham Mitzora or asham talui because they're different animals. And so the only solution is to bring the 2-year-old animal, which is the asham Mitzora, and say either it's an asham Mitzora or it's a shlamim, and that introduces the doubt that you're going to basically eat the animal only for one day, but that's the only solution of the problem. So that is why he talked about that case. Okay. Says the Gemara, now up to the Mishnah on Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. The next question is, so we've been talking up till now about you mixed up animals. Now we say, right, and remember then yesterday we said the case is if you mixed up chatichot, right? So you have pieces of the animal that are edible, that either are shlamim or chatat, you eat it like the more chamor, because there's no other solution. Our Mishnah talks about the limbs of the animal. Evarei chatat shnit arvu be'evarei ola. You have the limbs of a carbon chatat that are supposed to be eaten by the kohanim, right? You burn a small amount on the mizbeach and eat the rest by the kohanim. And you have the limbs of a carbon ola, which are not eaten at all, were burned entirely on the mizbeach. So you have a pile of meat, and some of it belongs to a chatat, some of it belongs to an ola. Obviously, there's different rules. So you might say, like we said yesterday, just burn it all in the mizbeach, right? That makes reasonable sense because you can't eat it, right? But remember, we said yesterday, there's a halacha, kol shemimenu liishim, anything that part of it already went up from the mizbeach, harehu bebal taktiro. You're not allowed to burn the rest of it on the mizbeach. So it's a lota say to burn more of it on the mizbeach. So if it's the chatat, you can't burn it on the mizbeach. So what do? Says the Mishnah, Evarei chatat nitarvu be'evarei ola. The parts of a chatat that are mixed with the parts of an ola. Rabbi Eliezer says, just put it all on the mizbeach. Yitain lemala. Put it all on top of the mizbeach. Now, what about the fact that you're taking parts of a chatat that are supposed to be eaten and you're putting them on the mizbeach, which you're not allowed to do? It's bebal taktiro. Ro'eh aniet besar chatat milamala kilohin etzim. What you do is you say, if whichever part of this is the chatat, I'm just using it for fuel. I'm not using it to burn it to Hashem as a karban, which you're not allowed to do. I'm just using it as the firewood, basically. You instead of putting wood on the fire, put meat on the fire, and it burns up the fire and it burns the rest of it. So you basically, like, this is what we said yesterday, of course, that you can not, l'reach, remember we said you can't put on the mizbeach l'reach nichoach, you can put on the mizbeach as a karban, but you can put on the mizbeach just to burn like wood. So that's what you do. That's what Rabbi Eliezer says, sorry. The Chachamim omrim, no, that's not a solution. And since it's not a solution, you can't put the meat on the Mizbeach. Because if it's from the Karban Chatat, it's not allowed to go on the Mizbeach. If it's from the Karban Olah, you're not allowed to eat it. So you can't eat it, you can't burn it. What you do is to Bar Tsuratam, you let their form change, I mean, you let them get old, which means they become notar and they become unkosher for anything. And Yatsu the Beit HaSrifa. And once they are notar, once they're left over and they don't look right, then you can't burn it on the Mizbeach, you can't eat it, you take it outside the Beit HaMikdash and you burn it where they would burn things outside, right, in the big burning pile. So that's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, my time with Rabbi Eliezer. What's Rabbi Eliezer's rationale that you're allowed to bring a karban chatat, put it on the mizbeach, and say it's just wood? Amar Krab, because the pasuk says, El hamizbeach lo ya'alu. Don't, these things are karban reshit l'Hashem. Don't put them on the mizbeach. L'reach nichoach. Don't put them on the mizbeach to make a good smell for Hashem. Meaning the reach nichoach ma'aleh. You can't put them on the mizbeach to make a good a karban avata ma'aleh l'shem etzim. But you can put them on the mizbeach as wood. And so as long as you say, look, I'm putting this on the mizbeach, the part that's an ola will be the reach nichoach, the part that's a chatat will be for wood, and that should be totally fine. So that's Rabbi Eliezer's proof from the pasuk, and we quoted this yesterday. And the Rabbanan, who disagree and say you can't put it on the mizbeach, they say, no, miut rachmana otam. The pasuk says, and I can read the pasuk, this is in the beginning of Vayikra, Bet Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, it says, Kol hamincha asher takriva l'Hashem lo taseh chametz, ki kol sa'ar v'chol dvash lo taktir mimenu ishe l'Hashem. That's the beginning of the pasuk. And then pasuk Yud Bet says, "Karban reshit takrivo otam lashem v'hamizbech lo yale." Bring them as a karban reshit. Remember, with the sor and the dvash, it's referring to the bikurim and the mincha of whatever shtei alechem. But you can bring them as a karban reshit, but don't put them on the mizbech. Al mizbech lo ya'alu l'reich nichoach lashem. Sorry, no lashem. L'reich nichoach. Say the Chachamim, it says Reshit Takrivo Otam, implying this pasuk is that says that you can put it on the mizbeach as long as it's not L'Reich Nichoach, is referring to only Otam. Otam, who I'm reading inside now, Diata Maleh, L'Reich Nichoach, is the words I would add here, which the Shita does. Those are the things you can't add, you can't bring on the mizbeach L'Reich Nichoach, Avata Maleh L'Shem Eitzim. But you could bring them on for wood. So if the Bikurim are put on the mizbeach, they're not allowed to be brought as a korban, but they can be brought as wood on the mizbeach. Avam midi achrini, but other things like a karban chatat or another karban, lo, those things cannot even be brought on the mizbeach, even if it's not done l'reich nichach and it's just done le'itzim. So therefore, the Chachamim say it's totally prohibited. Rebbe Eliezer, and what does Rebbe Eliezer respond to that? He would say, no. The word otam is for something else completely different. Otam, hu dirabbai lecha kevesh kimizbeach. What we're telling you is that by those things, meaning by bikurim and the shtei alechem, the sa'ar, those things are the ramp, the kevish of the mizbech is like the mizbech. Remember, there's a whole other halacha that there are certain things that if you put them up on the ramp, you no longer put them up on the mizbech, you no longer take them down, right? And the pasuk is saying these things, if you put them on the mizbeach, on the ramp, it's like you put them on the mizbeach, but only these things. And this is a different limud that we have in Menachot, which we're not doing today. But these are the things that are hu derabai lecha kevesh kimizbeach, avo machmidi achrini lo. But other things, the ramp is not like the mizbeach. Rabbanan tarti shmamina. And the Rabbanan say we see both things from that pasuk, and therefore that's why there's a machluket between Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. Okay, so that is how they explain the way they read the psukim. Now says the Gemara now, take a deep breath, we're 9 lines from the bottom, that matnitin deloki haitana. Our Mishnah, and again to remind you, our Mishnah said the following. It said if you have a varim of a chatat, you have parts, let's say you take a head of a chatat and a head of an olah. The head of an olah is burned on the mizbeach. The head of the chatat is taken and eaten by the kohanim. They boil it and make head stew. Okay, so you have two heads of cows, right, or whatever animals, and one is maybe not cows. Two heads of small animal goats. One is a chatat and one is an olah, and you have no idea which one is which. So what do? So our Mishnah said, according to Rebbe Eliezer, you put them both on the mizbeach and say, I'm burning them both. You can't burn a chatat that you're supposed to eat on the mizbeach. You say, the part that's an olah is a karban, and the part that's a chatat is wood. It's there for fire, meaning it's not as a karban to Hashem, it's just for fuel on the mizbeach. The Chachamim said that's a problem. You can't do that. Says the Gemara now, again, the first word on the line, 9 lines from the bottom, matniten deloki haitana. Our Mishnah is not like the following Tana, because there's a Tana, we'll see it's Rabbi Yehuda in a second, who has a much deeper distinction between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanya. This is what the following Braita says. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Says Rabbi Yehuda, lo nechluku Rabbi Eliezer Chachamim al evarei chatat sheneta'arvu be'evarei olah. In fact, the Chachamim do not disagree with Rabbi Eliezer if you have the case I just gave you, the head of a chatat and the head of an olah, sheyikruvu, that you can bring those both on the mizbeach. So the Chachamim would agree to Rebbe Eliezer, which is not what our Mishnah said. The Chachamim would agree to Rebbe Eliezer that you can take the head of the chatat and you could put it on the mizbeach and say this is wood. It's not ideal. It's okay. Where do they argue? The rovea v'nirva. Now, if you're talking about one of the heads of these animals, let's say they're both olah, but you get an announcement, by the way, that olah was rovea or nirva. Rovea and nirva means the animal had a human had sex with that animal, right? Or woman, a man, bestiality. That animal cannot be brought on the mizbeach. So let's say you didn't know that, you find it out later, and you have two pieces. One is from an animal that was a rovea nirva, that was a karban. One is a regular karban. There, for sure, everyone agrees. You can't say put them both on the mizbeach and one is wood, because that's already over the line, right? But rovea v'nirva shelo yikruvu. Everyone agrees, even Rebbe Eliezer, that you can't put that on the mizbeach, and you'd have to let it burn outside. Al manech leku, says Rabbi Yehuda, What are they arguing about? The fifth line from the bottom. Al Evarei Ola Tamima, where one of it is apart from an Ola that's Tamim, that's a regular Ola without a mum. Shenit Arvu Be'evarei Balat Mum. It got mixed with another Ola which had a wound, a mum. So you brought these two Olot to the Beit Mikdash, you shechted both of them, you sprinkled the blood on the Mizbeach, they cut it open, and one of them found, I mean, that's treifa really, but one of them they found out had a mum. It should have never been a carbon. It was a mistake. Someone overlooked it. Now you've got these two heads of the animal. They have no siman on them. One is an ola that's kosher, a tamim. One is an ola that's balat mum. There's a machloket where Rabbi Yehuda says, well, although it's a balmum, bring it up on the mizbeach and say it's wood. And the chachamim say, well, you can't put a balmum on the mizbeach. You got to wait till it ruins and burn it outside. So that's where they argue. Let's read that inside. Aman echliko al evarei olat mima, the limbs of a olat mima shnitarvu be'evarei balat mum. Rabbi Eliezer omer yikruvu. Rabbi Eliezer says you put it on the mizbeach. Beroeh ani limala kilo hein eitzim. And you say, look, the part that's not supposed to go on the mizbeach is like wood. He says, "Ro'eh ani et besar balat mum limala kilo hein eitzim." And the chachamim say, lo yikruvu. The Chachamim say, don't bring it. So this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and the Braita disagrees with our Mishnah. Because our Mishnah made it sound like the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer disagree in every case of a Chatat and an Olah. And this Braita says they don't disagree in a regular Chatat and Olah. They only disagree if one of the animals is a Balat Mum. Says the Gemara, what's the reason? Rabbi Chachamim, where my Rabbi Eliezer, Maishna Rovev and Yervad lo Chazu. Why is Rabbi Eliezer it's so obvious to him that if one of the animals is usher on the Mizbeach because it has been part of a bestiality, that you have to throw it away. It's just not chazon mizbeach, so don't put it on and say it's wood. It's off limits. So why isn't a balmum the same thing? Balmum nami lo chazu. A balmum is not kosher for the mizbeach. Why are you injecting your morality of why it's not kosher? They're not kosher. It's not kosher. Turn the page to Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Bet. Says Rav Huna, well, it must be a very specific balmum. It's not a regular balmum. If the animal was a balmum because it had I don't know, a broken leg or something we call a balmum, let's say, or I don't know, some disease, a tumor growing out of its neck, then it would not be kosher for the mizbeach. But this is talking about a case bedokin sheba'ayin. You're talking about these small, I don't know how we translate dok. Like lesions. I don't know what the English for dok
Cataract.
Cataract, thank you, Mary. Okay, now we got it too. We're talking about dokin sheba'ayin. You have little spots in the eye, which are a mum, but they're a subtle mum, and we treat it differently. And alibad Rabbi Akiva. This is according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. We had this opinion earlier, and we'll have it again, where Rabbi Akiva said, look, usually if you put a balmum on the mizbeach, you take it off the mizbeach. But if it's a very subtle balmum, like a dokin sheba'ayin, if it's already on the mizbeach, don't take it off the mizbeach. It's a minor mum, let's say. It's not such a big deal. And so here the case is where one animal had a mum, but it was a small mum, right? And therefore Rebbe Eliezer says, well, that's okay. You can put it up on the mizbeach and say it's wood. Okay? So it's dokin sheba'ayin v'alibad Rabbi Akiva, damrim alo lo yardu. Rabbi Akiva said, if you put that on the mizbeach, you don't have to take it off. Says Gemara, but that means you don't have to take it off. Amar to Amar Rabbi Akiva di avar. That if you put it on the mizbeach, don't take it off. Lechatchila mi amar. Did Rabbi Akiva say that you can actually say, okay, I have an animal, I know one of them is a balmum, but it's a minor balmum, so I'll put it up on the mizbeach and say it's wood. Rabbi Akiva never said that. Amar of Papa, well, of course, you have to explain that the case here is hachba mayaskinan kigon sh'alo gabe kevish, right? It's already on the mizbeach. It's on the ramp, right? So basically, the case here where Rabbi Yehuda says, or I'm sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehuda says in Rabbi Eliezer that if you have an animal of a balmum that is mixed with an animal that's not a balmum, that you can put them both on the mizbeach and say it's wood. That's only if the animal's already on the mizbeach. It's already on the kevish. Says Mariachi.
I've seen it. It's on it, but you haven't noticed the mum yet.
No, you have a piece of meat. The piece of meat doesn't have a mum.
You're putting the whole head on it, I thought.
I mean, let's say the mum is in the leg. So you discover the mum or you find out about the mum after you've cut apart the animal. So you can't tell which steak came from the animal. It's the balmum, right? The mum is not in the steak. So you have two steaks, basically, right? Or two heads, and there's a mum somewhere else. It says, well, the whole thing you're saying now is that the reason Rebbe Eliezer allows you to put on the Mizbeach is because he's going like Rebbe Akiva, and it's already on the Mizbeach. If it's already on the Mizbeach, you don't need to tell me a case where they're mixed up. It's not because one is a mum and one is not that you can burn it. Even if it was one that was a mum, According to Rabbi Akiva, if it's a minor mum, like dokin sheba'ayin, and it's already on the mizbeach, you don't take it off. So you're basically, it can't be the case. You're missing up the whole point. There's nothing to do with two animals mixed up. Even one would not be a problem. Filo be'inayo, meaning even if it was intact and you knew this was a piece of meat from a Baal mum, according to Rabbi Akiva, if it's a minor mum and it's on the mizbeach, you're allowed to burn it. Ella Taimei de Rabbi Eliezer. In fact, Rabbi Eliezer says that you can actually do it lichatchila. You can take this animal, this piece of meat from an animal that is known to be from a balmum and put it on the mizbeach because it's not alone, because it's mixed up with another one. And because there's two animals, so if it was one animal and you had a piece of meat and it was from a balmum, even if it was a minor balmum, nobody says you can walk it up the mizbeach and say I'm burning it for wood. But since you have two animals and one is kosher and one is not, basically, you're allowed to burn it for wood. And what's the rationale? Because miut rachmana, the pasuk says mum bum. There's a mum, and bum is lashon yachid in it. Hu delo yiratzu. If there's one animal with a mum, you can't put it on the mizbeach. Ha'ayede tarovet yiratzu. But if it's mixed up with others, there's a specific miut in the pasuk that you can actually take it up to the mizbeach and put it for wood.
Seems so weak.
Okay. Rabbanan say, mum bam. You know what mum bam tells you? Mum bam, it tells you, hu de lo yuratsu, if the mum is in it, ha avar mumam yuratsu. A whole new halacha that if you have a temporary mum in an animal and it gets better, you can actually put on the mizbeach, which is a huge chiddush. You have a karban, it develops a mum, you can't bring it on the mizbeach right now. A month later, it recovers, you can bring it as a karban, right? You don't say once it was nifsal, it's nifsal forever. It's a temporary thing. If it recovers, you go to a good veterinarian and your animal gets better, you can bring it as a karban. Say the chachamim, that's what mum bam tells you. There's a mum in it today is a problem, but if there was a mum in it a month ago and it's recovered, it's not a problem. And Rabbi Eliezer would say to you, that's a great limud. Rabbi Eliezer said, but it says bam bahem, right? It says bahem, what's the pasuk? It says, I have this fancy Gemara, it says, ki mashchatam bahem mum bam. So the bahem says the mum is in it, and mum bam tells you it can't be mixed. It's not a problem if it's mixed. And the Rabbanan say that, Nava said that that's a little bit weak, right? Rabbanan bam bahem lo darshi. Okay. Says the Gemara, well, that's very, very interesting. Because what you're basically saying now is that the case of Rebbe Eliezer, when Rebbe Eliezer says you can take an animal that's mixed with another animal, one animal has a mum, we don't know which one. And you can say because it's a minor mum, basically, and because the pasuk says mum bum, the only problem with the mum is when you know which animal is a mum, you can walk it up to the mizbeach and put it on. If that's the case, why did Rebbe Eliezer say you can take it up to the mizbeach and say it's wood? You don't need to say it's wood anymore, because now you're basically saying that the whole problem of a mum only applies when the animal's alone. But once it's mixed, there's no problem with a mum anymore. So Ihachi asked the Gemara, where am I? Ihachi, why does Rabbi Eliezer say, Ro'eh, ani, I see that it's as if it's wood, halach manach sherei. The Torah said you're allowed to bring this animal even though it has a mum because it's a mixed with another animal. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer really holds that opinion, which is a very far-fetched opinion. But he was saying, "L'divrayhem ka'amar lahu." He was saying, according to you, the Chachamim, Lididi. We are 4 lines before the Mishnah, 3 lines before the Mishnah. Lididi, according to my reading of the pasuk of Mumbam, Rachmana Achsherei. Torah says this is not a problem because it's mixed. But lididchu, according to you, Chachamim, that you have all these hang-ups and you still have a problem with a mum, but odilimia basar balat mum ke'etzim dami, right? Why can't you just walk it up the Mizbeach and say, it's just like wood? Midi dehavi abasar chatat. Just like basar chatat. Because remember, in Rabbi Yehuda's reading of the Braita, the Chachamim admit to Rabbi Eliezer that if you mix, unlike our Mishnah, that if you have one piece of chatat and one piece of ola, you can put them both on the Mizbeach and say the ola is an ola and the chatat is wood. So why don't you at least admit to me that even if you don't agree that a balmum that's mixed up is mutar for the Mizbeach, at least you could put it on the Mizbeach and say it's wood? And the Chachamim would respond and say there's a big difference. Rabbanan, hachamiisa, hatam lo miisa. Here it's ma'us, it's disgusting to the Mizbeach. God said don't bring a balmum. This is a balmum. So there's basically a fundamental prohibition on this. In the case of a chatat, there's no ma'us on the Mizbeach, it's just not the function. A chatat is eaten, not burned. So if you're going to burn it, you have to burn it like wood. But by a balmum, there's no way, according to the Chachamim, you could just put it on the Mizbeach and say, oh, ignore the fact that this is a mum, this is just a piece of wood. Because by that logic, actually, you could say the same thing about Rovea and Nirva, right? An animal is part of Avodah Zarah, or bestiality. Say, okay, but I'm putting it on the Mizbeach, it's wood. Clearly, the Torah does not allow you to do that, and that's why the Chachamim argue about balmum. So, and again, that's the end of that Gemara, but it's clearly different than our Mishnah, right? Because our Mishnah said there's a machloket when it's chatat and olah. According to Rabbi Yehuda's reading of the machloket, there is no such machloket. Because if it's a chatat and an olah, everybody agrees, even the chachamim, that you can put them both on the mizbeach, burn them both, and say the olah is for olah and the chatat is for wood. Okay, next Mishnah. We are midway down Ayin Zayin Amud Bet. The next Mishnah. Sorry, we're
You have
good.
a question.
Yeah.
There's a case that might have actually shed some more light on this. A wood from a tree that was used for idolatry. Can that be burned on the mizbeach?
Right. That's a relevant question. The answer is, of course, no, as you probably assume. Um, but it's a little bit different because there, of course, that is eitzim, right? So burning
Right.
eitzim that is eitzim might be a bigger problem than burning something that's not eitzim as eitzim. But just to be clear, our Gemara does not entertain the possibility that an animal that was worshipped for avodah zarah can be put on the mizbeach and say it's just wood, right?
Right.
We're just entertaining the question of a balmum. And this Mishnah now speaks it out explicitly. So says the next Mishnah, Evarim be'evarim balimumim. Let's say again you have the same issue. You have let's say you have 5 heads of animals that are waiting to be burned. Or you can imagine, Beit HaMikdash, they had a big waiting line on the way from the Mizbeach. If a lot of people came, it takes time to burn things, even if you have a very hot fire, right? So there was a line of people waiting to bring their karbanot, and the Kohanim did all this work, right? The people didn't do it, but the Kohanim were waiting to bring the karbanot. So you've got 5 heads of an animal, let's say, waiting to be burnt on the Mizbeach, and then you get an alert, one of them is a balmum. What do we do? Can you put them on the Mizbeach and burn them or not? So says the Mishnah, very interesting question. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Im karev rosh echad mehem yukavu kol haroshim. You know, if one of them, remember, you have 5 animals, and you said we're burning them all. We say, wait a second, stop. One of them is a balmum. Says Rabbi Eliezer, well, if you already burnt one of them, you're allowed to say that was probably the balmum. Put the rest on the mizbeach, right? You can rely on the one that you already burnt as being the balmum. So im karev rosh echad mehem, if you already brought one head of the animal, yikruvu kol haroshim. The rest of the heads are all permitted because you can assume that they're not the balmum. And kra'ayim shel echad mehem, if you brought the kra'ayim, which I think is like the flank of one of them, yikruvu kol kra'ayim, right? Kra'ayim is the intestines, maybe? I always confuse it. It's not the flank. Chazeh is the shok would be. Anyways, the crime, let's say some part of the inside. Someone has English will help me out. If you brought that part from one of them, you can do it for all of them. And the Chachamim say that's ridiculous, not ridiculous, but we disagree. Even if you brought there's 6 of them, and you brought 5 already, you can't say, I assume one of those 5 is the Baal Mum, and the 6th one should be okay. The 6th one is here. You don't know if it's the Mum or not. You can't burn it on the Mizbeach. You have to take it outside the Beit HaSrifa. Now, says the Gemara, Amar Rebbe Eliezer. This is Rebbe Eliezer, the Amora, probably. Lo hichsher Rebbe Eliezer, the Tana, el shnayim shayim. He only was matir if there are pairs, right? Aval echad lo, but he would not permit if it was one alone. And the reason being that as long as it's a pair, right, you know for sure, this is the way Rashi explains it, or Tosfot, someone explains it this way. Anyway, so you know for sure that if you have a pair, yeah, well, Rashi sort of says it. Tosfos, I think, says it. Oh, I have a Rashi on the side that says it clearer. That's what it was. I know I was confused. I don't know if everyone has that Rashi, but there's a Rashi Ktav Yad. It says on in Nava's fancy Gemara. But the way Rashi explains it a little bit more than he explains it here, is that if you have 2 heads, let's say, you know for sure one of them is okay. Because only one is a balmum. It's possible both are okay. So since for sure one of the acts that you're doing is okay, you can then say migo, which is a funny migo, but since that one of them is okay, we can assume the other one's okay too. What about there's a balmum? The one you already burned is the balmum. So you can basically combine the fact that you already burned one, and of the pair you have now, one is for sure kosher, to say burn them both on the mizbeach.
If you haven't burned any yet.
No, then you're not allowed to. If you didn't burn any yet, then you can't, according to the Mishnah, you can't burn them because you have to assume that this might be one. But if you basically can combine these two things, one has already been burned on the Mizbeach, that might be the Balmum, and I've got two, and one of them is for sure kosher, then it's okay to burn both of them, right? That's how Rashi explains it. So it's only if it's a pair, right? Shnaim, shnaim. Aval echad, echad, if you're doing it one at a time, lo, then you're not allowed to do it. Mativ Rabbi Yirmiyah says Rabbi Yirmiyah, our Mishnah does not make any sense if you say that, because when we're quoting our Mishnah, it says V'chachamim omrim, the Chachamim say, Afilu karvu kulam chutz me'echad mehem yatzu lebeit hasreifa. If you burn all of them except for one, you have to burn in Beit HaSreifa, implying Rabbi Eliezer disagrees even in that case. Even if you have all of them burnt except for one left, Rabbi Eliezer would say, put on the Mizbeach, and the Chachamim would say, you can't. Answers Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, Asbruch, I'll explain it to you, my echad zug echad. No, one means one pair left, right? If you're interpreting our Mishnah as pairs, then one means one pair. So that is how I would explain the end of our Mishnah. Let us do a few more lines just because it's early, even though these are short dapim for a change, for a break for us. But I'll read the Mishnah. Probably you'll do it again tomorrow. Says the final Mishnah of today on the bottom of Daf Ayin Zayin Amabet. What about dam? What if you have blood? Shnit arev b'mayim. Some water gets into your blood. Now, interestingly, and again, I'm going to just do this a little bit outside because there's time. This is almost the opposite of all the questions we think about with tarovet, right? When we think of tarovet, you're almost always thinking about you have, a little bit of treif, I don't know, stew, let's say, and you have a lot of kosher stew, right? And you pour a little bit of the treif inside of it, or you got a little bit of wine that's poured into a lot of water or grape juice or whatever it might be. The issue usually with tarovet is you have something that's mutar and a little bit of isser gets put into it. And the question is the isser make the whole thing asur? By carbon, it's the opposite because you basically have a container of blood that you're supposed to put on the mizbeach. You pour some water by mistake into that container of blood. Is it still blood? Is the question. Meaning, if you sprinkle it on the mizbeach, will you get a kapara or not get a kapara? So here the question is, can you cancel the status of blood? Not can you make it asur? Can you keep it mutar when it's blood? So you have a case where you have blood, and by mistake, or it rained, a Kohen poured some water into the container of blood. Can you still sprinkle that on the Mizbeach? Says the Mishnah, Dam Shnita
To be someone pouring water into it. It could be a sudden storm.
Right.
Drenching things with rain.
Absolutely. That would definitely wreak havoc on everything if it rained really quickly. So Dam Shintarev b'mayim, but you got blood mixed with water. Says the Mishnah, Im yesh bo marit dam, if it still looks like blood, kasher. Now, of course, the Mishnah does not define what does it look like blood mean, right? I mean, does it mean a tiny bit of red? Does it mean deep red? So Rashi says it means deep red, but even that, what does that mean, right? So anyways, if it still looks like blood, presumably meaning someone who sees it would say that looks like blood, then it's kosher. Then it's kosher to put on the mizbeach. But if it doesn't, if it looks very diluted, then you're out of luck. You can't put it on the mizbeach. Now, what if it's nitarev b'yayin? Then you got a big problem. If you pour wine, which does not come from the skies, right? You pour wine into the container by mistake. Now it looks red because the wine is red. But how do you know if it looks red because of the wine or because of the blood? Says the Gemara, well, you just do a simple scientific experiment, right? Imagine this much blood in a cup and this much water, right? Turn the wine into water and see what it looks like. So you can easily do proportions. And they probably had, factories where they set this up and they did, if it's 3 ounces of wine and 1 ounce of water, you can do the math. Okay. So what you should do is ro'in oto. You imagine, you do a theoretical experiment, which you could do in real life, kilo humayim. As if the wine was water, would it dilute out the color of blood? Now, what if it gets mixed with other blood? Nitarev b'dam behima or b'dam hachaya. Let's say you get other blood from the animal. It's not kosher to put on the mizbeach, but by mistake they mix together. Some, first day on the job, Kohen saw a container of blood, another container of blood. He said, "Let me mix these and wash them out." Right? And it turned out one was dam for sprinkling on the mizbeach, and one was dam behima, regular dam. So then what do? Right? So then the Mishnah says, "Roen otoki luhumayim." Same answer. Imagine that the second blood the non-mizbeach blood that you put in is water. If it dilutes the initial blood enough that you can't see that it's blood, it's not blood anymore. What?
How could different types of blood dilute?
No, I'm saying you imagine that the blood is water. So if you took 6 ounces of water and poured it into the original blood, it would not look like blood. Then it's not blood. even though what you poured in was 6 ounces of blood, so it still looks like blood. Says Rabbi Yehuda, and this is of course Rabbi Yehuda's opinion everywhere, that min bimino eno batel, right? That since it's the same thing, since it's not wine and it's not water, it's blood and blood, it will never be mevatel the first blood. And therefore, even if you put 1 ounce of blood and 100 ounces of other blood, it's still considered blood, initial blood. And if you pour that on the mizbeach, it's kosher. So says Rabbi Yehuda, Ein dam mevatel dam. Dam will never cancel other dam. However, now one more detail before we'll just read till the end of the Mishnah. Again, you can do it again tomorrow. Nit arev b'dam psulin. But if you mix this kosher blood with pasul blood, for example, blood from an animal that was done for avodah zarah, or blood that was, you had a machshava of pigol, let's say, chutz l'zmano or chutz l'mkomo, then yishafech la'ama. Then you dump the whole thing out. Not because it's batel, but because you're not allowed to pour that blood on the mizbeach, right? So since you can't put that blood on the mizbeach, you can't put the mixture on the mizbeach. And finally, b'dam hatamsit. Now, if let's say you mix the initial blood, remember the first blood that comes out of the animal when you slaughter it is called the dam of zrika, right? Dam hanefesh, we call it. And the rest of the blood is called dam tamsit. So you're not allowed to put that on the mizbeach. You're not supposed to. Excuse me. Let's say you forget and you collect the blood of hanefesh and you combine it with the dam tamsit. Says the Mishnah, yishafich la'amma. You also spill out that blood into the water, into the amma, right, into the channel, and you can't put it on the mizbech, and the animal's puzzle, and you have to bring a new carbon. And we'll see in the Gemara that seems to be a pretty exaggerated opinion, because why, although you're not allowed to use the dama tamsit for zrika, you're allowed to put it on the mizbeach. So the Gemara is going to say that this is like zera, and we'll talk about it as we go forward. But that is the Mishnah. And the final halacha in the Mishnah is Rebbe Eliezer machshir. Rebbe Eliezer says that's not a problem. You can use the mixed blood of the dam tamsit and the dam hanefesh. Imlo nimlach. Now, in all of these cases, if you didn't ask the advice, right? So you mixed blood from an avodah zarah, let's say, and a regular karban, and the Kohen didn't ask, which is often the best thing in life to do, right? Do the act and then ask permission later, and you just sprinkled on the mizbeach benatan, and it's kosher. Then it is kosher because you did put blood from the karban on the mizbeach. You just shouldn't have done that, but the guy might be grateful to you for doing it because he doesn't have to bring another karban now. But you're not supposed to do it because you're not supposed to put blood of avodah zarah on the mizbeach or any of the other cases. And of course, tomorrow, and as we go further, we will discuss the details of both mixtures. The Gemara has a very interesting discussion about how one thing becomes batel and another thing, and of course why dam tamtzit would not be put on the mizbeach. So we will stop there. Easier daf, thankfully, than yesterday.
There's a parallel issue regarding foods. For instance, how much can you dilute wine or grape juice and still have it kosher for kiddush, for arbacosa?
Exactly.
And Kedem even sells a diluted grape juice that they
Right.
say.
No, exactly. It's the exact same question. I mean, that actually is very relevant. You're correct because it's not a question of isser. It's a question of what is it, right? Is it still wine or is it water? But when you talk about isser, right there, it gets a little more complicated. Like a little bit of yain nesach, for example, right? Of course, is a challenge. But remember the more particular challenge to yain nesach is that it's min bimino, right? It's the same thing. So even a drop of yain nesach, if it's into wine, is a much bigger problem than if it's into water or something. No, the Gemara tomorrow, and we will continue. We'll keep discussing this question over this week. So Shavua Tov, all. Have a great week. We'll see you soon.
Shavuot Tov. Thank you.
Welcome.
Shavuot Tov.